Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Africa Week at King's College London. My name is Flavia Gasbarri. I am a lecturer in the Department of World Studies at King's College and the co-chair of the KCL Africa Research Group, which is one of the co-organizers of the Africa Week. I'm very happy today to be part of another day rich of events, and I'm even happier to host and to chair this discussion today, Going Digital, the Present and Future of African Archives and Museums. We have a great panel today. Let me immediately introduce our speakers, starting with Dr. Colin Darch, live from Cape Town. Dr. Darch is a fellow of the Human Science Research Council of South Africa and an honorary researcher at the University of Cape Town. He's an expert of Mozambique. He has extensively researched and published on the history of Mozambique, among other things, of course. I would encourage to visit his website, Mozambique History Net, where you can find a lot of material on Mozambique history. His research interests also include the role of intellectual property laws in relation to development issues in less developed countries and freedom of information issues in Africa. Then we have Dr. Vincent Hiribarren, who is a senior lecturer in modern African history in the Department of History at King's College. He's an expert of history of West Africa, particularly in Nigeria. He has worked on several digital humanities projects, and he's currently leading on a project of digitalization of national archives in Nigeria. And finally, we have Dr. Livio Sansone, live from Brazil. So thank you for joining so early in the morning for you. Dr. Sansone is full professor of anthropology at the Federal University of Bahia. He's the head of the Factory of Ideas program, which is an advanced international course in ethnic and African studies. And he coordinates the Digital Museum of African and Afro-Brazilian Heritage. He has published extensively on youth culture, ethnicity, inequalities, international transit of ideas, race and anti-racism, anthropology and colonialism, and globalization. So a warm welcome to all of you. The discussion today for this event is focused on several issues that I believe are crucial in relation to the themes of the Africa Week this year, and generally speaking for the broader research in Africa, the broader debate of research in Africa. There is an important effort in academia today aimed at promoting research on Africa and even more at promoting the inclusion of the scholarship from the continent into the academic debates, into the teaching programs. We have heard a lot about this in several events yesterday too. At the same time, it's true that access to primary sources and archival materials often remains a challenge for scholars and researchers on Africa and in Africa. So the question here is to what extent new technologies can provide a solution to this problem, to what extent the growing digitalization of African archives and museums can open new possibilities for research in and on Africa, and what are also the potential problems and potential challenges and side effects of this process. Thinking about problems of intellectual property, copyright, technical issues, political problems, and so on. So this event today wants to address these themes and promoting a discussion on these issues and these problems. So what we're going to do now, our three speakers will talk approximately 10-15 minutes each. We start with Dr. Darch, who will talk about and point out some, I would say, broader problems concerning research in Africa, concerning the system of scientific communication and knowledge production in Africa and on Africa. And then Dr. Hiribarren and Dr. Sansone will discuss some more specific aspects of the digitalization of archives and museums, drawn from their own work and first-hand experience with digital archives. We really want to hear about your work here today. And of course, at the end of the presentations, we will open the debate and we welcome comments and questions from the public. In this regard, at the bottom of your screen, if you want to post some comments or questions, there is a button, both the chat and the Q&A button. So if you want to intervene in the discussion with questions and comments, please type your questions and comments in this section. Okay, so I leave now the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Darch. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Flavia. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I'm very pleased to be here, even if it's only virtually. Perhaps I should say that what my remarks are based on nearly 40 years of experience of researching in different African countries. Although I'm South African, I've lived and worked in Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and I've visited many other African countries for various academic purposes. So this isn't just a South African perspective. But let me start at the beginning. The modern system of scientific communication was actually born in Europe, as we all know, in the 18th century with the foundation of the Geographic and Scientific Societies and the first appearance of scientific journals which disseminated what were essentially minutes of their meetings. By the middle of the 20th century, this system had spread around the world. Based on that, I want to argue, first of all, that this system as it exists marginalizes knowledge production in the global south. And secondly, that the system is presently being privatized by profit-driven commercial entities and is becoming a closed system. And it's doing that by exploiting intellectual property laws like copyright, as well as other ones, and other mechanisms as well. Academics, I believe, need to pay much more serious attention to IP issues, intellectual property issues. And in this context, African scholars who struggle to get published generally, and when they are successful in getting published, then have to buy their own research back from publishers in rich countries, are at a structural disadvantage. The idea of scientific communication is basically very simple. Researchers consult primary documentation in the archive, secondary documentation in various libraries. They gather physical evidence from museums or archaeological collections or archaeological digs, and often collate this information with interviews or other kinds of surveys. Then they write a textual narrative and submit that to a publisher, goes for peer review and evaluation, and then appears as a book or in a journal. Publication is distributed and deposited in libraries, and the cycle begins again. But in Africa, this chain is broken in several places. Researchers need to reach their target audience, whether it's academic colleagues or a wider public, and they need especially to reach teachers and students in schools. Research needs to filter through the entire education system in general via its reproduction in textbooks, down in secondary and even primary levels in the school system. But the functioning of this system is changing rapidly and arbitrarily worldwide and is compromised in the post-colonial African countries, which are divided by dysfunctional distribution networks or non-existent distribution networks, and by language difficulties and differences. The problem of language, and I just want to make a few remarks about this, includes powerful pressure to publish in English, especially for articles in scientific journals. Printed book distribution networks are extraordinarily weak in Africa. Book prices are very high. Academic libraries as physical spaces for research are all but disappearing. And we see poor conservation of archival material in multiple countries, in multiple situations. On top of this, the increasing aggressiveness of the intellectual property system is a threat, and the problems associated with the internet and the web as reliable and accessible delivery systems for all students is still not solved. What can you trust and what can't you trust? South African and African universities don't take the training of social scientists or historians in language seriously enough. The University of Cape Town, which is my university, offers some half-hearted lessons in Portuguese, but it abandoned Swahili completely a few years ago and only teaches 2 of our 9 officially recognized African languages. In South Africa, there are strong structural and financial incentives reinforcing the pressure to publish in English. Academic publishing is oriented towards what are called the international academic journals, which is code for journals in English published in the UK or the United States. As a South African academic, every time I publish something in a government recognized journal, my university receives about 80,000 Rand as a subsidy. My articles in Portuguese earn my university absolutely nothing. A major challenge in Africa is the weakness of distribution networks for books and journals published in neighboring countries. South African bookstores and libraries are full of English language books imported from the United States and England. Senegal is full of books published in Paris, and works from Lisbon and Porto are easy to find in Luanda or Maputo. But try to find a publication from Zimbabwe in a South African bookstore, or look for an Angolan book for sale in Mozambique and you'll have no luck. Several years ago, I used to travel around Africa as a university employee, collecting academic monographs published locally in countries like Mozambique, Senegal, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Zambia, which was not only the most effective way, but in fact, the only way that we could add national publications to our university's research collections. Otherwise, researchers have to rely on a network of personal contacts and informal channels to keep up with essential texts. I have people in Mozambique who alert me to new publications and sometimes buy them for me and then send them with somebody who's traveling. Academic archives and libraries in many African countries are in very bad shape, as we know from personal experience, with budgets so low that they can't even support undergraduate teaching, let alone maintain or process research collections. Many African researchers today don't have access to the full range of sources, printed and electronic, primary and secondary, that they actually need to carry out their work. In addition to all this, we need to create space for a plurality of authentic voices and a multiplicity of local forms of knowledge. But the global network of scientific communication supports particular epistemologies, specific languages, and specific foci of research, all imposed from outside. 2 decades ago, Paul Tiambe-Zeleza identified an implicit division of labor in this situation, in which African scholars produce the empirical research, which Northern Africanists then process into their major studies. Much African knowledge production remains almost invisible, and I think this is what you were talking about yesterday. But even knowledge about Africa produced by Africanist scholars remains trapped in the area studies ghettos, considered as, in the mainstream, often as theoretically unsophisticated. Nevertheless, even within this distorted picture, knowledge about Africa is produced mainly in Europe and North America, remains under Northern curatorship, and is disseminated from the North. This is a fairly gloomy picture, I recognize that, but I don't believe that the only path to a project to enhance an African intellectual heritage has to do only with the simple replacement of dominant Western knowledge systems with Afrocentrism or with Southern epistemology, although both of those things are valuable. The truth is that African self-knowledge has been and remains largely marginalized and silenced, and I do believe that we have to face up to that fact. One last point. The marginalization of knowledge production in the Southern Hemisphere isn't only in the social sciences and history. There's a case which was cited a few years ago of a Mexican oncologist, Luis Benitez Bribiesca, and it's quite illuminating. When he returned to Mexico after working in Germany and the United States for a number of years, he found that, and this is a quote from his own writing, "Changing my address made a difference to peer review. As a resident of Boston, I was able to publish articles in the American Journal of Pathology with well-known North American pathologists. They passed quickly from evaluation to publication without any problem. Then I went to work at the University of Bonn in Germany, and 2 of my articles were published in the journal Nature. Then I came back to Mexico with more experience and more maturity. But now, when I sent my papers to the same scientific journals, they were immediately returned unopened." Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much for this concise but extremely fascinating talk. You have raised like 1,000 interesting points that would require, I think, 2 hours to discuss each of them. So thank you very much, Dr. Darch. Next speaker, Dr. Hiribarren, please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Morning and good afternoon. So my name is Vincent Hiribarren. I'm at King's College London. I will talk today about different digitization projects which exist in Africa, and I will try to analyze them and try to assess what's happening right now. So basically, I will divide my talk into two different parts. In the first part, I will talk about a few projects, and then I will try to discuss the issues surrounding them. So you will see I will try to share my screen. So bear with me 2 seconds. This is it here. There you go. What you've got in front of you is one of the first digitization projects which were created in Africa, and Colin Darch just talked about South Africa. Actually, it's very interesting because actually the South Africans started digitizing documents in huge numbers at the beginning of 2000s. They were the first ones to do that in Africa in general. Here, what you've got is basically the materials gathered for a project called the Struggle for Freedom in Southern Africa, with material from different countries. With different participating countries. It was done by Aluka at the start. It's a Zulu word, and the Zulu Aluka project was absorbed by JSTOR a few years ago. But just to tell you actually that this phenomenon started 20 years ago, and it started in South Africa. And you've got the first example in front of you. Second example I'd like to choose is a colleague of ours from Michigan State University, University of Michigan, sorry. It's called Derek Peterson, who works on Uganda. And as a specialist of Uganda, he's worked with different archivists located in the country, and has worked with national archives, but also with regional archives and also university archives in the past in the country. And what he's done is try to create different catalogs and try to digitize certain documents here. So you got, a lot of scholars as well who've devoted their lives to basically cataloging the material, working with certain archives and certain archivists. In this case, you've got the case of Uganda, very much linked to one individual here. You also have, different projects existing throughout the planet, basically here, and you might see this one here, which is the Endangered Archives Program of the British Library. So it's a British, it's not funded by Britain, so it's funded by Arcadia, which is a philanthropist organization, but the money is channeled through the British Library. And here you've got a project I basically was part of in Madagascar a couple of years ago, well, 4 years ago now, sorry, 4 years ago. And you've got some documents in front of you in Malagasy in English, but also in lots of different languages. On the website of the British Library, you find different projects which deal with the whole planet, so not just Africa. And that's something which we're thinking about, and how you've got a lot of projects being done at the moment in different parts of the world, and Africa may not be an isolated case here. Let me just carry on very quickly with this list before I start, criticizing what's happening. But the idea as well is to show you that there are different projects on the planet. There's also something happening at UCLA. So there you go. That's the one at UCLA called the Modern Indigenous Archives Program. And this time people focus much more on what's called modern, which is a very strange term to call, I guess, post-colonial archives in this case. But you've got audio recordings, videos, and different parts, for different parts of the world again, And again, I'm part of the board at the moment, so that's I need to acknowledge here. And finally, one personal project here I'm involved with. I'm trying to catalog the archives in Nigeria very quickly, so I created this very small website where I want more people to access archival documents from different parts of Nigeria. The idea today is not to give you a full list of what exists. If you're interested, I can give you a whole summary of this talk today. I can give you an article even about that. The idea is to show you actually that these projects have been existing for the last 20 years. And there are there are quite a few problems about them. Everyone is happy to find these archives online, especially now with COVID-19. That's quite nice. Yes, but actually, who funds them? And that's one of the things which needs to be asked here. Is like, where does the money come from? I'm, as you can tell, I'm not from any African country. I'm a European scholar based in the British University. What's happening here? I'm getting money from my own university. I'm part of these projects myself, and I like to just stop for a moment and think about what's happening here. There are a lot of scholars who've been interested in a lot of scholars would be interested in technological advances in digital humanities, and I could be definitely one of them. Yes, so there's the whole digital humanities background here, but sometimes it tends to be a bit positivist somehow, with this idea that progress will help us deal with COVID-19, with the situation, with the lack of funding in African universities, and somehow here there's a clear, strange belief here, which is this belief in science. It's like a quite extraordinary when you think about it, and I'm part of it somehow. There's also the fact that there are many people just extremely interested in this in data produced coming from these archives, and that's I'm exploiting this data myself for my own research purposes. Many researchers are, but who is using these archives, African digitized archives? Who can access them really? Colleagues based in Africa might not have the time or the money or the internet connection to access the documents themselves. So basically, that begs the question as who is benefiting from it. I'm not saying that many African scholars are not accessing the documents. If you go to large cities in Nairobi or Lagos, I'm sure people can access them. But if you are from a medium-sized town in a country like Ghana or elsewhere, you might not have access to all of this. And somehow this kind of begs the question of why people want to do this in the first place. There's someone based in the US called Peter Lim, who's worked on Southern African history a lot, who said that I'm quoting him right now, who said that 21st century missionaries carry not Bibles but scanners. I like this quote because actually it tells us a story which is about this belief, but also this idea that people will be saved thanks to the digitization projects. And so we need to think much more about what's happening here. And I will finish with a couple of issues basically which could be very, very obvious here. Like Colin Darch before, there's a real problem with intellectual property. Who does this material belong to? You might have seen on my screen before that I was sharing. All these documents are available online, but actually they belong to the states who produced them. See these Malagasy documents that showed you before belong to Malagasy states. So obviously I had a discussion with the offices of the Prime Minister, actually, we directly deal with archives in Madagascar to talk about this question. But still, there's this real question. What's happening here if we make all this material available for free, and who does it really belong to in the end? Because if it ends up online, it can be reproduced everywhere else. So that's the first question, I guess, I want us to think about, and that's this. What's happening now in terms of digitization could lead to a real problem of digital scramble for Africa. That's a phrase which has been used as well. The second problem is the problem of, which is linked to it, is the problem of sovereignty. Sovereignty of the countries, if we deal with national archives, and if we deal with everything technological as well. In general, the whole digital infrastructure in many African countries does not work in the same way as it does in many Western countries. Our data centers, where you've got all the servers containing the pictures, tend to be located in the West. So there are quite a few in South Africa, but in the rest of the continent, there's quite a lot in Cairo, Nairobi, Nigeria a bit, but actually most of them tend to be in America or Europe. So if you want to access a file, actually where it's going to be located, it's going to be located in Europe. So where is the material physically actually? So like this recording actually, which is recording right now, you know, it might end up on the cloud, but actually the recording ends up somewhere, really. And there's a place that's going to be a hard drive in a server where it's going to be located. So really, that's a question of sovereignty and what happens to this material. I'm not saying that, you know, all these digitization projects and programs are evil or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying here. I hope, you know, that's not the message I'm saying here. But I'm saying that we need to be extremely careful what's happening right now, because we could see this digitization project as, you know, as helping us in a difficult situation right now, whereas we need to think about collaborations with institutions, with political, well, with those who have power, basically, in the relevant countries here. And this is more than necessary, especially in a situation which was described just before, of poor funding in academia in African countries, but also in situations where governments want, you know, to accept any form of help without asking too many questions. So I think it's an ethical question as well. And I think I will stop here. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the further questions, very difficult questions and controversial problems that you raised, and also for showing us some actual digital archives that probably are not very well known to everybody. So they exist, and everybody's welcome to use them. Thank you very much, Vincent. Okay, so our last speaker, Dr. Sansone, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation, Flavia. Good morning for me and good afternoon for all of you. I agree entirely with the picture given by Colin and Vincent. I couldn't agree more. Digital is vital, but can be fatal. However, I want to shift to a different register, which, although strived with tensions, seems to offer new opportunities in the field of political use of memory, heritage preservation, and heritage education. And we have a tension, which has already been mentioned. All over the global south, communication has developed much faster than physical opportunity have. So we have lots of opportunities, lots of news, but the physicality of it is lacking. In fact, one of the aspects that characterize the global south vis-a-vis the global north, besides poor indication of quality of life, is scarce access to physical libraries, archives, and museums, not to mention museum visitations, because if we compare figures, it's shameful, the situation. This is poor when compared to access to communication technology or conspicuous consumption more generally. So people have communication, conspicuous consumption as regards communication, but little physical, the physical part of it. In the meantime, together with the communication revolution, let's say 15 years ago, the smartphone revolution, specifically in Africa, and I find it difficult to see discussion on digitalization without this joint from technological development and popular technology as part of it. In the meantime, together with the communication revolution, new claims for representations have emerged from subaltern groups that also want to become part of the performance of diversity by being portrayed positively in museums, archives, and heritage exhibits. Over the last decade, new communication technologies seem to have changed and broadened the horizon for museum exhibits and heritage preservation more generally anyhow. Social media are part of it. Difficult today to speak about preservation, digitalization without mentioning social media. That's the way people produce their own heritage in many ways and preserve it and discuss about it and comment on other people's heritage. Just two examples out of my own hat. The carnival of Bissau, Guinea-Bissau, the largest carnival west of Brazil, for sure, in terms of number. Very scarce pictures available up to 10 years ago. Just Google it nowadays, Bissau Carnival, and you see how many perhaps tens of thousands by now of images are available. Videos, YouTube is full of, so you don't actually have to travel to Bissau experience to some extent the Carnaval of Bissau. The same relates to Eduardo Mondlane. I'm presently, as Colin knows, busy with a research on the intellectual trajectory of Eduardo Mondlane, which of course has to do a lot with documents and sharing of documents and circulation of documents. We have moved from no images of Mondlane online, I can quantify it at some point, to a plethora of images and information and that are not somehow freely redistributed, and Colin is part of it, by the way. Is one of the producers of much of this information. He and Shihab, our friend Shihab, and without Shihab, we wouldn't be able to do any science in Latin America for that matter. So we are moved from no images to a plethora of moving images online. You do not need to travel to. I remember I traveled to the Dogon Plateau 35 years ago after Guatemala. This is typical anthropological experience. Try to go, and how difficult it was to take pictures then. You know, to negotiate like 2 hours and many beers in order to take one single picture. Nowadays, lots of stuff on the Dogon online, Dogon fashion, Dogon's images. So there is something that's a change, and I think our discussion on digitalization and the digital in Africa needs to come to terms with it. New communication technology have a profound impact on the construction of collective memory and its relationship with the process of identity, as well as the development of heritage infrastructure. Which of course is much stronger in South Africa than, for instance, in Mozambique or Guinea-Bissau. They have produced a new visual culture, which has been researched by many people, which has benefited from the print to online transition of news, and that of the photography from film to digital image, resulting in a proliferation of user-friendly resources for making online films, self-portraits, and visual autobiographies through platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Nowadays, TikTok is a big part of it, and to some extent, WhatsApp. I dare say most contemporary Afro-Brazilian, talking from Brazil, cultural traditions and of course music genre are now generously represented on social networks. The rapid shift from oral culture to mobile telephones and then smartphones, quickly leaving the written paper culture behind, to which the pandemic certainly helps. And nowadays, physical librarians are concerned with the survival of physical books as such, not to mention the transnational circulation, because they can be vectors or whatever pandemic, a virus in many ways. So the written book is endangered itself, not only the archive. So this trend through headphone landline. Through telephone landlines and desktop computers. This is leaving behind telephone landlines and desktop computers, which are a reminder of the global north. Who has a telephone? Who has a landline nowadays in the third world? Nobody. Who has a desktop computer? These are things for the north. This all begs reflection. The relationship between the means, oral, printed, or digital, and the workings and politics of memory is not self-evident, as Vincent has mentioned, and needs to be researched in specific contexts. Does digital writing make things more uniform and carry the same authority as the printed word? Is publishing online in Codestra Bulletin as prestigious as publishing in Africa Today in the United States? For instance, this is a dilemma. I chose Codestra Bulletin for political reasons. But if we go back to what Colin said, what our university benefits from, then it's much better to publish in a US journal than an online Codestra journal. Still, I think that we have to make a political move, and particularly the senior ones, such as I, who perhaps will be less penalized by not publishing in prestigious journals, should make perhaps this radical choice of publishing in African-funded journals or whatever. It's a funny situation, sorry. Just, even the journal Global South is done entirely in the United States. There's a journal called Global South, which is not managed in the South. And there is not a bloody Southerner, even a sham Southerner, such as Isaiah, I was born in Italy, that is represented in the editorial board. Things are funny nowadays, aren't they? So let me sum it up. Digitalization also affects identity politics, since digital and online archives have a considerable impact, not only on the politics of storage of documentation. It's a big issue that Vincent touched at the end of this, who stores. Americans universities invest an amazing amount of money, even progressive, in digital humanities. It's funny. Oftentimes concerned with archives in the South. There's not a single investment in, not a single cent in digital humanities in the global South I'm aware of, from Indonesia to Brazil. I've been doing research on that. If you click digital humanities on Google, it all 95% of it is in the United States, and to some extent now a little bit in Britain and the Netherlands and France. So there is something wrong with it. As I said, digitalization affects digital and online archives have a considerable impact, not only on the politics of storage or documentation, but also on the politics of the past, memory, and the future of traditions. If we are to establish new and more equal lines of international cooperation, trying to stimulate new comparative perspectives among different colonial traditions and new methods and languages, new methodologies focus on dialogues and sharing, the question of how much and how freely documents ought to be digitized and made available in this format are possibly online needs to be considered. The old Aluka scandal is a big, which has been mentioned, which was produced in South Africa by Pramesh Lalo, a new form of digital ludism and an upsurge against digitalization. It's revealing, perceived as a betrayal in many ways. You know, it started public and it became private. It got completely JSTORized. You know, it's a scandal with Mellon Foundation money, which they want to give to us because we were not African enough in Brazil. They give it to you, and it got wrong. You see, Vincent. The key issues are identifying the giving and receiving end in this process, or who retains the original documents, as Vincent said, and who receives the digital copy, and how freely, and for how long. Who owns the cloud? Since we are after, who is the owner of the cloud? What's happening? What will happen to these billions of videos? All my classes are in YouTube nowadays, since we all went virtual. Who is the owner of this huge digital library, which is YouTube, which is essential for ethnic movements all over and subaltern groups all over the global South? Different points of view emerge. Those of local and visiting scholars, archivists, funders, ordinary visitors to the archive, virtual visitors, and so forth. None of them is univocal. I know that Vincent is related to the Prince Class Foundation, so was I. So apart from that, there is also the whimsicality of foundation. It depends largely on who's the head of the Prince Class Foundation. There is everything is moving. Certainly in the field of foundations. In general, the archivist community, and Colin knows best, is largely concerned with conservation, while the research community with access is concerned especially with access and circulation. And I do not believe that digital technology to be the solution, of course, however. It provides new context and offers new possibilities. The digital medium is a means, not an end in itself. In fact, we could say it is rather like a foreign language. Nowadays, all over the global South, there is this celebration of foreign languages. Speaking a foreign language makes no sense. You can say lots of stupidity in a foreign language. I speak 8 languages and I can say stupid things. So I'll also call in many languages. So the same applies to the digital medium. It's a means. Useful only if you are something to say in it, which is a big problem, which Vincent touched on. I've not got the experience, it's uncomparable, less than Vincent with African archive, but the few I know, it's depressing to walk into the digitizing room of many archives. I can't mention the names because I don't want to make enemies, and see how digitalization, if there is no politics of digitalization, makes no sense. People don't know what to do with digital copies. In fact, those who know what to do are those in the North who have political projects as to digital production issued from the South. The question is that people who digitize things, whether in Mozambique or in Bissau or in other countries I can mention, don't exactly have in mind, they receive money from a certain foundation to digitize because they have to digitize. And so what? Of course, if you're a salvationist, a la France Boys, let's salvage whatever. If you go to Guinea-Bissau and you see the archive, whatever thing is better than nothing. But then these archives, when they're used, are only used in Lisbon virtually. So this, unfortunately, it's not digitalization itself. There is no politics involved that solves it. Do I have 5 more minutes?
Yes, no problem.
Yes. Otherwise, we invent it.
No, it's okay. Just finish.
Let me finish with the irony, and then I touch upon my project, the Digital Museum, which you can see online, because I was very much stimulated by the two colleagues before me, by the call, the gentle invitation by Flavia. So although virtual or digital museum should not be viewed as substitute for physical museum and digital and physical visits, or tactile and digital experiences, should be viewed as complementary. I agree on that. In theory, everybody nowadays agree with it. There is an irony. One has to be aware of this irony, by which digital museum and intangible heritage, more generally, seems in some way to be the solution to the historic lack of museum and archive in the global south. It is the global north that focuses more on tangible heritage and physical musealization. Just have to go to UNESCO list of tangible and intangible heritage, and it speaks for itself. And it is necessary to reflect on this more closely on the interface between technology and the way we remember, celebrate, choose, and organize our ideas as much as in our own minds. So this irony that we are left with the digital, with the virtual, with the intangible, and often without politics, and digital humanities are built somewhere else, and we are left to digitize ourselves, so to speak, without knowing exactly what to do. This is the big issue. An attempt to intervene, and I really finish in 2 minutes, in this geopolitics, digital geopolitics of knowledge, because the big issue is to what extent is the digitization of Africa, if I can say so, improving the production, the condition for the production of knowledge for African studies writ large, and especially for African studies developed from within the continent. And I have my doubts. Our project for a digital museum we call Afro Digital, of Afro-Brazilian and African heritage, and we insist on using the African, but we are desperately trying to establish connection to projects in Africa, and we have them, especially with Guinea-Bissau, as you have understood, and Cape Verde, and to some extent the historical archive of Mozambique, which we've been trying to construct, and it's a difficult process, difficult to get money, difficult to get the kind of amount of money an archive of that size requires. A large archive on Eduardo Mondlane, digital archive on Eduardo Mondlane, with no owner, but multi-centered, multi-language, and again, hope that Colin can help us with Russian, and we have to help people, 5 people can help us with the Chinese. But our archive, our project started, in fact, as an archive of Afro-Bahian studies, and it all started in many ways as part of my own research on the making of African and Afro-Brazilian studies in Brazil. It started at the Melville Herskovits Library at Northwestern and the Schomburg Center in New York, where I found the picture when I went there many years, 20 years ago. I found a picture of the making on my institute in '42 by lecture of Melville Herskovits, which is not available in our universities. And I came to realize, what the hell is this doing in a funny place like a Schomburg Center, in a gallery with the Schomburg, normally not where it should be at the entrance of my institute. So we came to realize that it was difficult to take those kind of things away from the Americans, and we realized that they were very excited by the notion of digital repatriation. Particularly the Smithsonian. was because they get so many claims, as much as the British Museum. Apparently, the British Museum gets 1 claim per day of repatriation, almost none. The idea of digital repatriation is one of the. Please be. You can be stingy with the original. Hold on to your guns. Keep the originals. Store them properly. We have a very bad climate, humidity, and we are not preserved people. You're preserved people. But be generous with the digital copy. Please give us the digital copy free of charge. And this is actually, we managed with this mission to get it free of charge, even in high resolution. So we managed to get all copies of everything, and thousands of images by MLB in Brazil, which, by the way, was stored at the Museum of African Art in the Smithsonian Gallery, because they thought they were African photos, but they were in fact taken in Bahia. Nobody had ever cared to do research among those photos. They were stored together with the Haitian photos in the Museum of African Culture. The second key notion of our museum is digital donation. We try in a country where nobody donates anything, because the donation is a political act that works in a situation of saturation of knowledge and heritage infrastructure. Britain is, people are happy to donate. It is fiscal interest, and there is a culture of donation. This does not occur in Brazil, and even less so in Africa. When people can, they create their own archive. Now there's their own blog, their own activity. There is very little. If there is no relationship, if heritage preservation is not part of this social pact, people do not donate. So we try to incentive donation of documents to us, by which we have something people can sign. This can be circulated because it took us a while, by which people remain owners of the documents, but we can use the digital image. Secondly, two more notions beyond our project, which is still a project, not yet a museum, is digital ethnography and digital generosity. I cannot expand on that for lack of time, but the idea is that nowadays lots of our ethnography is in fact either digitized or digitable, or can be recorded and made available, and part of it can be made available because people want it to make available. The notion of privacy has changed a lot since people produce images and their own biography on YouTube and TikTok and all the rest. Attitude to people we often have to disguise, for which as anthropologists have to use pseudonyms, now want to appear and to be seen much more than in the past, or co-participate with our presentation, our data. So this is something also we have to engage, and by digital ethnography. And digital generosity relates to the idea that the idea of sharing, of collective curatorship, of crowd sharing, which is done in many ways informally. I'm thinking of what happens across many of the HNet networks that are, although they are based, both of them at the University of Michigan, they're very generous, and you get people. I got people to interact with my drafts, and you can even think of hypertext or communal writings projects in many ways, which is extremely necessary in the case of a complex biography and trajectory, such as the one of Eduardo Chivamo Mumlani, who was a cosmopolitan and a nationalist, and whose life cannot be reduced by a single biography written by a single soul. It's got to be a collective project to be successful. You can check our museum on. I will circulate the link, museo afrodigital.com.br. But we are still very much in need for. We're looking for a stable cloud. We just applied a safe cloud, because the cloud from our university is not the server of our university is not powerful enough, because the university has got no money to pay for a powerful antivirus. We're paying a cloud, which is the pandemic's most global south went bananas because they got overburdened. And now we're looking for a powerful cloud, and hopefully we get one for free, the Cluster of Excellence in African Studies, University of Bayreuth. So we're depending on the cloud again. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Livio, for adding so many points on the discussion already, on the points and the issues already mentioned by Colin and Vincent, particularly the role of the images, like particularly in this complementary process between digital access and physical access. There are a lot of material, a lot of things to discuss. Okay, I have myself like 255 questions for all of you, but first of all, I would like to give some space to the public, to those who are following us live, and then maybe, I mean, if we have time, I can ask some of my questions and make some of my comments. Okay, so the first question is from Kieran Mitton. Thanks for such brilliant and engaging discussion from all panelists. A common theme was the issue of accessibility and sovereignty. If this is systemic, is there anything we as scholars can do to address this? Would pushing back against the paywalls and the tyranny of journal prestige ranking solve anything? Just to mention, Dr. Kieran Mitton is the other co-chair of the Africa Research Group. Thank you for joining us. So, any of you wants to intervene? Hello, can you hear me? Yes, yes, please, Colin. Yes.
I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but of course it's very important. In Mozambique, which is the African country I know best after South Africa, it's interesting that what's happening more and more, and this relates to what I was talking about earlier, that particularly in the discipline of history, Mozambican historians are publishing more and more in English. The Journal of Southern African Studies, Journal of African History, and so on. And part of that is because of the structure of the academic career. In order to, move from assistant lecturer to assistant professor and so on, you have to publish in peer-reviewed, regularly appearing journals. And the number of those in the Portuguese-speaking world is much more limited than it is in English. There was, in the 1980s, a different practice in Mozambique. I mean, I don't think this is viable any longer, but in the Center of African Studies where I worked in that period, we actually had a completely different academic practice, which was not to engage with the idea of the academic career at all. And the people who were there suffered for this decision later on. I can think of one of my colleagues who subsequently came to South Africa and stayed at a very low level rank in the academic structure because she had a black hole in her career where she apparently had done no research. Because she was part of a collective, what the Center of African Studies did was to publish, to work collectively with students in our development course, with whom we did field work and all the rest of it. And then the reports were written collectively without any single author. And ironically, one of the results of that was a study of labor migration from Inhambane province, which subsequently appeared as a book in England of a quite well-known academic press, which insisted that an author had to be named in order to sell this book. And it appeared with Ruth's first name as the author, even though, for example, I personally wrote 2 of the chapters and various other people, it was genuinely a collective work. Mm-hmm. So the pressure of the academic career, how to push back against that kind of situation, the interests in play are, intellectual property issues, the role of big academic publishers like Elsevier and so on and so forth. The weight of that sort of power structure makes any kind of pushback, I think, extraordinarily difficult. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but I really don't know. Open access is part of the solution, but all that does is gives access to the kind of material that's already being produced. What it doesn't do is help to support an epistemological shift or a shift in the structure of knowledge production.
Thank you very much, Colin. Vincent, yes, please.
Yeah, to answer Kieran's question, I think let me give you a precise example here. I'm a co-editor, an editor for a journal based in the US. Most scholars are West African, but still working in the US. But what's happening here at the moment is that, well, we can't convince our West African colleagues to publish with us. Why? Because actually publishing an article with an American journal takes 2 years, whereas if you want to have a better salary based, if you're Nigeria or Ghana, for example, you would rather publish with a local journal. And if you are Francophone African, I know less the situation what's happening in Lusophone countries in West Africa, but still, if you're a Francophone speaker, the journal doesn't work for them because it's not recognized by this regional institution, which is called CAMES, which recognizes journals. So basically, no luck here either. So I suppose there's there are 2 different or 3 or 4 different tracks here, and this leads to even a bigger separation of the scholarship, having scholarship produced on Africa, outside of Africa, which is becoming quite independent from Africa itself, divorced from Africa in a way which is doesn't make sense when you think about it. I don't think I've got any solutions here at all, but myself, I'm quite pessimistic, and that's quite it's happening right now, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty pessimistic, and I think to some extent this is linked to what Colin said as an opening statement, that the modern system of scientific communication was born in Europe in the 18th century, and it seems that nobody ever contested it, not just in the south, but also in the north. I mean, and this creates a sort, as Colin was saying, a sort of vicious circle for which we are forced to follow some rules because we are linked to our academic pattern, and we can't just get out from this sort of established pattern. So, yes.
Can I say something? I think, of course, Colin knows much better than I the situation. I think that open access and political choices at stake. I was last year at the African Study Association meeting in Boston for the first time. Very interesting meeting, very polemical. Herskovits Matufo, Dai, very radical. Nobody talked about Creative Commons or open access, even the most radical ones. It's taboo in the United States, and to some extent also in Britain. Why is it? I mean, I might be wrong, but why is it not conceivable to in an ideal world, to look for funding so that we can make the Journal of Southern African Studies accessible for free? Why is it impossible? Why do I have to pay $50 or $60? Luckily, I have enough friends who send it to me in PDF all over the world, apart from Shihab, thank God. But I mean, this is the situation, and why is it not negotiable that certain countries can access it for free? Why do we have to take it for granted? Why don't we engage more with some of the Codesri recommendation in this field? I mean, I think that I would have put, instead of a person such as I, somebody from Codesri in this panel with due respect towards the event, which is wonderful, because I think that we have to close ranks besides those who have been trying to discuss about this whole thing, the situation. And there are quite a few interesting things, even in Codesri Bulletin, exactly on these topics, which would have been useful for the discussion. But basically, I think we do not have to give it up. It is difficult. Of course, Elsevier is a Dutch multinational, not even that politically correct in many ways for those who know Dutch history. But I mean, there must be something that could be. Why cannot we conceive the African Study Association to produce a journal that's open access, for instance, the American, so powerful African Study Association? Why is it not part of the mind?
Thank you for this positive encouragement and this broad pessimism, Livio. Okay, we have other 2 questions. The first is from Marco Weiss, directly to Vincent. Many thanks to all the speakers for their fascinating talks and insights. I would have a question for Vincent, if I may. Is your Nigerian archives project mainly for the Kaduna branch, or will you also focus on other branches?
Thank you for your question. Well, basically, what I would simply say is that I've worked mainly on northern Nigeria so far, but the current situation in northern Nigeria is not, well, it's not going very well. But I'm gonna live and work in southwestern Nigeria, from January on, and I will work 200 meters away from National Archives in Ibadan. So the answer is yes, but it's going to start soon.
Thank you, Vincent. Another question from Vivian Chang. Thank you for such a wonderful and stimulating discussion to all of you. What are your thoughts regarding the archives of multilateral institutions like the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa? Do these tend to be more accessible and better funded and preserved? And are there similar concerns for the intended audiences? Yes, Vincent? Hello? Yeah, please, Vincent.
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure I can answer the question specifically about these two institutions, I'm afraid. But the African Union, I've contacted the archives before, and they actually keep them, but I've never used them. But I've met the former archivist of the Bank of West Africa for the French franc, basically, well, the CFA franc, sorry, I call it French, but it's still very much dominated by France, and who's now the main archivist of UNESCO. And yes, they've got a policy of making the archives available, especially for the UNESCO. They've got more and more archives online at the moment, and they're actually looking for people to use them. UNESCO is based in Paris, physically. The buildings are in Paris, and the archives are in Paris. They want people to use the archives more. I don't know if you've seen, they've got a kind of online library / archive center where they make lots of documents widely accessible, and you can go there now, and it's quite interesting for the history of the institution. So sorry I can't reply directly about those institutions, but maybe what other ones.
Thank you. Colin and Livio, yes, please, if you have anything to add.
This isn't really an answer to that specific question, but there is another archival problem, particularly in Southern Africa, which is the question of access to the archives of the liberation movements. The Frelimo archive, for example, is there, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get access to it. I mean, certain people who have, there are scholars who are known to have the right sort of political connections who get access, but their work is not, I'm not going to name any names, but their work is not as interesting as it might be, given that they've got access to that kind of material. The Zimbabwean liberation movement's archives are also remain closed to this day. And obviously there's some degree, this is clearly a political question, but for example, for the kind of thing that Livio is doing, on Eduardo Mondlane, access to that kind of material. There's a Fitateca in the Frelimo archive, a tape recording archive, which has recordings of Central Committee meetings of the liberation movement during the armed struggle. And I mean, I've seen that stuff listed, but to get permission to listen to it is another question altogether. So I think, the access thing is not only a question of the state of degradation of archives and so on. And the OAU, the liberation, what was it called? The Liberation Committee of the OAU, there was a massive publication of the Hashim Mbita project, where they published, I think it was 9 or 12 volumes of interview material and so on, but none of it, as far as I've seen, is primary reproduction of actual documentation. It's interviews and depositions of people who participated in those struggles. So those things kind of get tangled up with each other, I think.
If I may add on this point, Colin, sorry, because you said there is a political problems, of course, behind it, the lack of access to these archives. So do you think there is a sort of responsibility? Because we talk a lot about including different voices, a plurality of voices, these voices into academia, into teaching programs, into, academic debates. But I mean, there is some responsibility from their part to make these voices accessible.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Mozambique, obviously there's a kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but there's a kind of political meta-narrative in which the armed struggle for national liberation becomes the modern history of the country. And the Mozambican historian João Paulo Borges Coelho has named that the liberation script. And he says, that the periodization of modern Mozambican history from the 1960s onwards becomes periodized by the happening of the various party congresses, which resolve the crisis of the previous period and so on. And of course, that's a use of archival and historical record in order to present a particular view, and it dominates. It's very difficult to resist that. There have been attempts at counter narratives, but I mean, in academic terms, they're fairly, I mean, to say laughable is perhaps to be too kind. I mean, there are memoirs by Frelimo dissidents, which are just, you know, exaggerated complaints, basically. So the history of liberation struggles in Southern Africa is extraordinarily difficult to write. What has happened more recently, sorry if I'm going on too long.
It's okay.
What's happened recently is that a lot of the Frelimo militants, and this hasn't, oddly enough, this hasn't happened to quite the same extent in South Africa. I'm not aware of Namibia or Angola, but there are lots and lots and lots of memoirs, and including collections of interviews by people. So you get these big fat volumes with people saying what they did in the struggle, you know, what I did in the war. And what a colleague and I have done recently is to sit down and actually do a really detailed comparative reading of all these accounts to see what they reveal about what was as it were really happening. And what we see is a much less sort of triumphalist progress from the launching of the armed struggle to the eventual departure of the Portuguese over those 10 years. Mm-hmm. We see, you know, you can see by this kind of intertextual reading, the difficulties, the defeats that Frelimo faced, the fact that they were learning how to wage the struggle by waging the struggle. And that's, of course, much more interesting historically than just saying, you know, sort of the North Korean, you know, march from the beginning of the struggle to eventual victory. I mean, one of my favorite historians, Guicciardini, says somewhere in the Ricordi that it may sometimes help you that justice is on your side, but it's a mistake to rely on that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Livio, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have a question to Colin, which is not a rhetorical one, I swear. Colin, I've been waiting since I know myself Brazilian, let's say almost 30 years ago, I've been waiting for an archive of the most well-known Bahian anthropologist, Tales de Azevedo, who was central for the making of Afro-Brazilian study, the UNESCO project, to Herskovits and all the rest, to open. I arrived here in 1990, and the archive is still not open. His family is falling apart, he's dead, long, and the archive is still not available. I decided to complete the book recently on the making of Afro-Brazilian study and Herskovits in Brazil just last week, because I've been using the pandemic. So let's write this book after all, which prepares the research on Mondlane in many ways. So I adjusted myself to dynamics of the archive in this part of the global south, which is Bahia, that you know a little bit. To what extent are we to expect a radical change in Mozambique? Is it not that perhaps, as I'm trying to do little by little, I better adjust to the condition of the archive in Mozambique rather than expecting it to change? I think that you know how complex the relationship and how careful you have to poise yourself in between members of a family or of the family and the Frelimo, and you need to talk to the opposition, but not too much. I think that we better, for the time being, we better adjust to the African condition, if I can say so, instead of expecting the African condition to change as we wish. We live in a funny situation where the American archive we speak so badly of, certainly I, funny places such as Gainesville, and are disclosing documents, the documents that were the part of which was repatriated to Brazil, where the state closed and are still not accessible, and you had to travel to Campinas to receive it. So perhaps we have to develop a survival strategy by which we accept for the time being the good archives are in the north, and in the south we need to create a certain, you need to deal politically with what's available. I don't know. Give me a suggestion.
I think there are windows of opportunity, but they're more open to, in the case of Mozambique, they're more open to Mozambican historians. Benedito Machado finished his PhD in Michigan, I think, quite a couple of years ago. He was researching on the sort of the genealogy of punishment in Mozambique, and he went to Niassa, where there was an Opération Produção, where the marginais were sent to, and so on. And the governor of Niassa at that time was Arlindo Chilundu, who is also a historian. And quietly, Benedita got access to all the archives of the provincial government there and found some really fascinating stuff. But of course, that's not a structural solution. It's entirely opportunistic in the sense that, you know, he's Mozambican. The guy who controlled access was not an archivist, but was a historian as well as a politician. And so, you know, magic happened. But I think you're absolutely right that the adjustment to the reality of the fact that, you know, the archives, the African archives, are not going to be suddenly become, you know, there have been periods when Maria Negrete Costa was the director of the archive. There was a lot of dynamism there, but all her staff are now elderly or retired and so on. And the reproduction of that culture of archival responsibility is very difficult to maintain. I mean, Vincent may have a comment on that with his experience in West Africa.
No, I think you've said, I think you've summarized everything I was going to say. It's exactly the same situation what I've seen in the West African countries I visited myself. So, I've talked mainly to archivists working in, I worked with archivists based in Nigeria, but also in Ivory Coast, Benin, and Madagascar. It's exactly the same situation you're describing here. And there's no easy solution here. There's the ICA, the International Council for Archives. They've got sub-branches depending on which part of Africa they're from. And so in West Africa, there's one sub-branch called West Africa, and they share the same kind of feelings. There's no, there's no money basically, and there's no, even at institutional level, basically, that doesn't work basically. So yes, yeah.
Thank you all. I just want to move on to another question we have from the public. It's from Nicolas Tilianou, who asks quite technical specific question. If important archives are held in the UK but relate to people in Africa, do we have the right to digitize them? For example, photographs of people that they and their descendants may not want shared, but may be useful to researchers. Who decides about this material? What is the process for this?
The only thing I would say is that first, this would mean that archives are catalogued at item level. It means that each photo will need to be captioned with metadata properly, this kind of details. If this is the case, which is quite unlikely, but if this is the case, there's the whole issue of digitizing it, and there won't be any money for it most of the time, even in the UK. It's impossible for the National Archives in the UK to digitize more than 5% of the whole collections. And even if they know who is in the photo, and if they have the money, there's a whole ethical question of the kind of photos which we need to be shared, or well, it depends on the situation, I suppose, but I'm not sure descendants would have a right to to say anything. I would just say that actually it's much more about the content of the photo. If it depicts pornography, violence, I guess there's that as well, the whole ethical situation behind it. So I'm afraid that's the only thing I could say now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no more questions from the public, I wait for maybe others to be posted. I just would like to ask, to make some comments and also ask questions to the three of you on some themes, on some issues, which relates also to the broader themes of the Africa Week that we are having this week up until Friday. First of all, I mean, you already mentioned something, but the impact of the current crisis of COVID-19 on all the problems that you mentioned, whether what we are living, basically the fact that we are online, even this event is online, and everything is going online. Everywhere in the world. Our library at King's College made a huge effort throughout the summer to digitalize as many things as possible in order to make them available for the students. We are delivering teaching online this year. So how the current crisis will impact, if there will be any impact, all the problems that you have mentioned. And then another issue that I found it's basically common pretty much to all your talks, which is what I would call the north-south or west and non-west communication. Colin, at the beginning you said that basically replace the Eurocentric system with an Afrocentric system is just not the solution. So basically, and also Vincent and Livio, you mentioned the fact that, for instance, data services are in the West. So we need some sort of productive communication between these two realities. We shouldn't, if we really want to include more voices from the continent, really include scholarship from the continent, I believe we shouldn't just go into the mistake of create a sort of dichotomy or opposition between Eurocentric and African-centric, but I think the two systems should communicate in order to really broaden up and become really inclusive. And I found this a kind of common theme in all your interventions. So if you have anything to say about that, thank you. Anyone who wants to start first?
I think this in a way relates to this idea of Zelez's, of the division of labor that exists in African studies, and part of it, I think, is that it lies in the very concept of African studies itself. And if you look at the sort of the history of area studies, and particularly African studies, you see, you know, what is the origin? It's the origin of African studies is the white colonial power seeking to understand the social dynamics of the subject peoples. And I think the compromise, the historical compromise of anthropology, with all due apologies to Livio as an anthropologist, is precisely that. That's the difficulty that anthropology faces as a discipline. You know, apart from all those problems about the ethnographic present and the ahistoricism and all the rest of it. And so that division of labor and that sort of colonial gaze question is part of the actual structure of and you know, you guys are sitting in King's College London in an African studies program, and you're facing exactly that problem. I mean, how, you know, what are you looking at and what's the perspective you're looking at it from? In the case of Brazil, I mean, South America is itself both the subject and the object in this. It's almost a sort of triangulation in the sense that Brazil is carrying out African studies, but South America, Latin America is itself the subject of an area studies paradigm. And I recently wrote a paper for a Russian journal about the difficulties that Russian Africanistica faces in almost exactly the same way that Soviet studies. You know, there are all these crossed gazes. You know, there's a sort of transversality going on. And I think, you know, in some ways that enriches everything, because, you know, obviously part of my pleasure in being focused on Mozambican studies is that even after all this time, it's still strange to me. You know, I'm originally, I grew up in Britain. And so, you know, when I went to Tanzania or former British colonies, I recognized a lot of the sort of Britishness of those places. When I went to Mozambique, everything was strange. And so that gives me a kind of both an advantage and a disadvantage. I don't know if I'm making sense or answering the question, but I think the way forward may be not to deny that transversality, those crossed gazes, but to find new ways of using them to enrich the way we see each other. I don't know if that helps, but.
No, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't really a question, it was more a comment, and it, of course, opened up for more reflection of this. And Livio and Vincent.
The same way, it wasn't really an answer.
it's okay.
No,
I don't think there are fixed answers to all the
problems. It was not an answer, but it was interesting.
Absolutely.
I think we have to create more condition for different gazes from different corners to meet. And this is, of course, very much self-centered, because in nowadays, especially because of technological advancement. We can think of biography as originally, by definition, an individual oeuvre to become something collective. And the idea of different perspective and different tradition, and oftentimes associated with different colonial tradition and different languages. Perhaps the digital world offers new opportunity for this process that Colin wishes, of different perspective, cross-cutting and contaminating one another. I don't know, perhaps we should work north-south, using intelligent money available where it is, to make Mozambique History Net more attuned to I wouldn't say to TikTok, Colin, but why not? But to would pop up the volume and the access. But you're instead of inventing the wheel, like we say in Portuguese, improving the wheel. We have Mozambique History Net, make it interactive, make the connection to social media more intensive, work on its Facebook side. I don't know, use the fact that we speak several languages to try to get agents in different corners of the world that can, on certain topics. And this kind of project, I think I find exciting and absolutely available for this. And I think that this is extremely more exciting than having to relate to the British Library whenever you have an endangered archive in the South, which is quite funny. Money which is not British, which could be given to somebody, to another library of Jakarta for some reason, and to save the archive in the South. This is something that irritates me to some extent, but I don't mind. But I think we should at this point, we have to, as much as we have to adjust, you see, Colin, to the African archive, rather than expecting it to change, we have to adjust to the global north, which is not, I don't expect it to change, which is even more problematic and resilient, because the African archive might change. The global north could take a long time to change.
All right, thank you very much. Vincent, I don't know if you have any final comments on this, or also on the impact of COVID, maybe. Can't hear you, sorry, you're muted. Okay, you're fine, okay. Okay, well, I think if there are no other questions, I can see other questions from the public. Also, time is running over, so I would end here these fascinating talks. I mean, there will be thousands more issues to discuss. Hopefully, this has been just a starting point for further debate and further discussion on this theme. I encourage everybody to look at the work of our panelists today, of the work on the digital archives and the digital humanities projects. I thank you everybody for attending. I would like to join me in a kind of virtual imaginary round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much, everybody, and our Africa Week continue with more events up to Friday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.